This is a Rough Tiger production.
And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful.
How do?
Uh, how do indeed, Brian, and how do to all the listeners out there. Happy March, everybody. Happy March. And
Time just keeps passing.
I hope everybody out there is doing well. Welcome to Dream Idiots. I'm Morris, one of your idiots, and the other idiot is Brian Treat, Brian, you went blazer shopping, which means we're old when you just go and shop for a blazer. So
Yes, I had to go. I had to go buy a blazer that was at an annoyingly large size, but just the way it is. So someone asked me the other day. I was mentioning in passing about this podcast because I was talking about something else, and they said, "Oh, you have another podcast?" I was talking about real estate and other stuff I do, and told them it was called Dream Idiots. And then this person asked me, "So is it called the Dream Idiots podcast? So is it for Dream Idiots, or are you the Dream Idiots?" And that's a good that's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that question, but
yes.
all the above.
Yes to both. All of the above. Each week, Brian and I tell each other stories, and we bring you along for the ride. And you can find us at a bunch of places. You've already found us if you're listening to us now, though. You can
Absolutely,
find us via email. You can find us on the internet. You can find us probably stuck to the underside of restaurant tables somewhere.
Bathroom stalls all over, all the good places.
On the bathroom stalls at questionable restaurants and places, all kinds of places you can find Dream Idiots.
Yeah, check us out. It's dreamidiots.com on Facebook, on Instagram. We're at Dream Idiots. And then dreamidiots.podcast@gmail is our email address. And please follow and like and subscribe and do those things for us. February was our biggest month by a fairly large margin, actually. So the audience keeps growing. So we appreciate that.
Which is strange because it's a widow month. It's a widow bitty month. Brian, it is episode 59. It's an odd numbered month, which means, or it's an odd numbered episode. So you get to go first this time. What you got for us this week?
Well, I had one story that I was considering telling this week, and about a young woman named Rosalind Franklin. And she was a woman who was a physicist and was critical, played a very large role in the discovery about the double helix nature of DNA, and didn't really get credit for it and passed away at a young age. But then I heard a profile of her on NPR. But I wanted to tell a worthwhile story, considering this is now Women's History Month. I wanted to start the month off with an interesting story about I think, rather wonderful and compelling and interesting woman. But if you want to read about DNA and you're scientifically minded, look up Rosalind Franklin. She's definitely worthy of a read and doing some research. And I'll probably put the link to the NPR story in the show notes. But instead of talking about Rosalind,
she's my cousin, actually. She's my cousin.
Are you joking?
She's my cousin. It's what my grandfather used to always say when we bring up the last name Franklin. She's a cousin of ours. So I'm kidding.
She could well be. Yeah, who knows? Instead of talking about Rosalind, we're going to talk about a young lady named Fannie Lucy Radmall. Just because she is incredibly cool and played an important part in an interesting story from history that actually relates to a story we told on this podcast many, many months ago. So she was born 8th of April, 1857 in London, England. She was the fourth daughter of Thomas Radmall and Maria Isabella Clark. So one of 10 children. This is, at a time in world history where infant mortality was a serious thing, and only half of her siblings made it to adulthood. Nevertheless, she did. As a young woman, she was a dancer and a chorus girl briefly under the name Poppy. But she was born, this is obviously 150, 170 years ago. And she was born across the Thames, which, it's now sort of central London. But at the times, if you lived across the Thames, it was a rough life. And you were, desperately, desperately poor. But at the age of 16, Poppy, it says in the notes, she took up with a wealthy man, a guy who was twice her age. His name was Freddie Gretton, and he was from a wealthy family. They were co-owners of the Bass Brewery, and she wound up being his mistress for 10 years. He was big into horse racing and all the other trappings of extreme wealth in England at the time. One of his horses won what was the Stayers Triple Crown in England at the time. But Gretton died in 1882, but he left her a legacy of £6,000 a year for the rest of her life. £6,000 a year. This is now 1870s or so. That works out to be about £225,000 a year in current dollars. So she's basically set for life. So now that she has all this economic security, she decides she wants a stage career, but it's incredibly short-lived. She starts one production, and she's there for exactly 3 weeks when she elopes with a guy named Theodore Francis Brinkman. Also quite wealthy. He's the son of the second baronet, Sir Thomas Brinkman. They married in September of 1883. The relationship was, didn't work out. Somehow they stayed together they were married for 12 years. Didn't actually divorce until January of 1895, but they were separated for the majority of those 12 years, apparently. So I guess that's not husband number 2, but relationship number 2 is already now over. And she goes on to the next one. This guy is George Byron, the 9th Baron Byron. He is a lifelong, what they called at the time, a confirmed bachelor. And during this time, she was called Lady Byron, and she was already, maybe not wealthy according to aristocratic standards, but certainly had plenty of income from that first relationship. Yeah. And so this is early part of the 20th century. I'm sorry, tail end of the 19th century. And, she's an active suffragette and starts using her money for all these initiatives and things that are being pushed at the time for women's rights. She paid the bail for Emmeline Pankhurst at least once. During World War I, she dives into the war effort and starts a campaign sending matches to troops, sending matches, and then later on a sock campaign, much like the way that homeless always need socks. Apparently, soldiers always need socks as well. So she worked really hard to make sure to send matches and socks to soldiers. And later that year, this is 1917. The Lord Baron Byron, the 9th Baron Byron, dies in March of 1917. Later that year, Lucy is appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for her creation of a facility called the Bluebird's Nest, which is a rest home on Hampstead Heath that's used exclusively for nurses who served on the Western Front during World War I. So moving forward, she's now into her 50s, maybe even early 60s. She is then marries a man named Sir Robert Houston, first baronet, member of Parliament for West Toxteth, and he's again another wealthy.
I'm sorry. the names that are flying fast and
Yes.
furious in this.
Uh-huh.
Baron Byron's talk stuffs. Okay.
Right. It's like a bit from some Monty Python routine, like West talks tip. Okay, whatever. Another incredibly wealthy man. He is described as being hard, ruthless, and unpleasant. Not exactly sure why he was so desirable. Maybe it was just
Well,
the
he's a
money.
talk stiff man, Brian.
Well,
He's
there
a
you
talk
go.
stiff man. Of
So,
course, he's going to be hard and unpleasant.
I'm asking a stupid question. And so, she pursued this guy for 7 years, and finally managed to convince him to marry. They didn't marry until 12th of December 1924. They move into a place called Beaufield House at Saint Saviour, Jersey. And they do this quote I don't quite understand this, for the purposes of tax avoidance. They live some of their time there, in that house in Jersey, and then Houston had a fabulous yacht called the Liberty, and so again, this is wild, extravagant, over the top lifestyle. At some point, Sir Robert actually shows her a copy of his will, and her response, she apparently was offended by what she was being allotted in his will, and she tore it up because it only allotted £1 million to her, and she made it perfectly clear that was that was insufficient. And it's ridiculous. He does eventually die. He actually dies on board shortly thereafter on the Liberty. For all I know, maybe she killed him. Who knows? But they were married for only really just a few months, and he leaves behind £5.5 million to her after this. So she's gone from abject poverty to now she is the second wealthiest woman in all of England. She is friends with Winston Churchill, who at the time is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically Secretary of the Treasury. And because at the time there must have been some death duties, and estate tax of some sort that was supposed to be paid, but it was I didn't really get into the details of this. It's not really that important, but she did wind up paying 1.6 million pounds in order to offset this liability without acknowledging any blame. So, but she has all this money, and she now actually has this Liberty boat as well. So 1931, some bad things start to happen in Europe in the early 30s. Some gentlemen named Hitler and Mussolini are gathering strength. Lady Houston, as she's now known after her husband number 3, she started giving money to British aviation. 1931, she donated £100,000 to the company Supermarine, and they basically these funds allowed them to compete in. They won something called the Schneider Trophy. It was basically an aviation competition because they were pushing new technologies to make sure that aviation was better, stronger, and most importantly, faster than the aviation that they had in place during World War One. It's very, very clear through all of this that she is very much an advocate for England having a very, very strong, almost dictatorial leader in that same vein as Mussolini and Hitler. She wants someone who is, has that sort of ironclad approach, and she's just not seeing this at the time in England. The prime minister at the time is named Ramsay MacDonald, and he's apparently just sort of spineless, and they don't want to spend any money whatsoever on aviation because this is depression. They're broke. She gives $100,000 to Supermarine to basically allows them to win this competition and greatly advances the cause of aviation in England. Later on in 1932, she offers to give £200,000 directly to British Armed Forces to help fund aviation. Initially, they actually refused this contribution, and she was so livid because basically it's fairly clear that she could see what was coming. She's like, we this is England, and our government doesn't can't afford to protect us. This is ridiculous. So the boat that she inherited from Lord Houston, she put together basically electrified signage in the rigging of the boat, and sailed around England with this lighting that said "Down with MacDonald the traitor," because she's just so sick to death of him. And she apparently, this is, I mean, I didn't look. I should look afterwards and see if I can find a good picture of the Liberty. I judge it's a extravagant boat. She was again, this is the 1930s. She was something of a nudist. That apparently she would, as a matter of routine, when she they'd sail around England, reach where were they their next destination, drop anchor. She would make the entire crew of the boat go down below, basically, so she could strip down to her skivvies and sunbathe and walk around the deck naked. Like, yeah, okay, in the 30s, that's way ahead of your time. So anyway, she is basically she's the title that she's been informally given is Savior of the Spitfire, because her contributions to aviation helped Supermarine down that course of technology that allowed that plane to be built and refined and made perfect. And we talked about the Spitfire way back in episode number 8, almost a year ago. So it was all made, all came to fruition because of her. She later on, 1933, she is now 76. She buys a paper called the Saturday Review. Again, she is, really trying to, instill power sort of in this sort of centralized fashion. She is not only a friend of Winston Churchill, but also becomes friends with Edward VIII, and is doing whatever she can behind the scenes with this paper and with her connections to basically make him as ironclad a leader as is humanly possible. And of course, that doesn't go well, because he goes off and marries that Simpson woman and abdicates the throne, right around this time. And basically by virtue of his abdication, she is distraught and is convinced that it's more or less going to be a lost cause. And so she's basically in bed. While she's still bedridden, she continues to run and edit the Saturday Review. But when he gives up the throne, she is convinced that the combination of Hitler, Mussolini, and communism in general is basically beckoning, is at England's doorstep. And she kind of gives up. She stops eating, and she dies of a heart attack on the 29th of December, 1936, age 79, at her home. And with all that money, she left no will, and she had no children. But her contributions to aviation, basically pretty directly helped win World War II, even though she never knew it.
Wow. And of course, the Spitfire is what our number crunching, Nazi stomping Hazel Hill worked on.
Exactly.
With her father back in episode one of the early episodes. Right.
I'd look quickly. It was number 8.
Never heard of her.
Yep, Lady Houston.
Wow, that long ago.
Sailing around with a nasty sign in
so
her
her full name.
Well, her full name at death.
I got your clock stiff right here.
Because it changed. So she's listed as Dame Fanny Lucy Houston, Lady Houston, Baroness Byron Radmall. And she lived to be 79, which is, at that time, just phenomenal lifespan, considering lifespan then was probably 48. So
Fanny Lucy Tuck Stiff Baron Byron
Von Chesterton
Pfeffer
Austin Pepper Incorporated.
Munchausen by proxy. Wow. I never heard of her. That is sailing around with basically a wagging the middle finger at.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible.
Well, yeah, this is
Great story. That's a great story, Brian.
before TikTok, before before all that. And I love that she pulled into wherever, some town along the coast, drop anchor, and okay, boys, go down below. Because apparently they knew what she was doing.
I need my me time.
So yeah,
boys.
God love her. So, Lady Houston.
All righty. Well, thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great way to start off the month of March.
Yes, and very, very important woman. And I'll probably have more important women later in the month. But she's if you want to know more, definitely Google her. She's definitely hilarious. All right, and I have some curse words for you.
All right. Yes.
Time for the Dream Idiot's curse word of the week.
It's what?
I said never. No, not ready.
Not ready. Okay. So I went down a tiny bit of a wormhole several months ago, and then kind of forgot I had forgotten this. I forgot I had forgotten this. Wow, my Alzheimer's is terrible today. There are a number of towns all over the world that have, for reasons that escape me, have adopted just terrible names, terrible names, and then they put these names on street signs, and they're all over the country and all over the world. I'm going to focus on one here at the end, but there is, just in Texas, we have near where I live, there's Comfort and Welfare, and there's Dime Box, Texas, and apparently there's Ding Dong, Texas. In Michigan, there's Climax, Michigan. In Europe, you have Titlis, Switzerland, and Condom, France, for reasons I don't quite understand. In the Philippines, you have a town called Sexmone. In Pennsylvania, there's a town called Intercourse. In England, there's a town called Thong.
Thong.
Thong. In Switzerland, there's a town called Wankdorf. In Scotland, there's a town called Twat. Germany has a town called Wiener, although I'm sure it's pronounced Wiener. Good old Missouri. This is very. I just can't help but go when I hear this. Missouri has a town called Knoblich, and then there's the sister city to Knoblich, which is in Kentucky, which is called Beaver Lick. Folks, just rename your town Hamilton, Jefferson City. Just pick a last name and just go with it. In Japan, there's a town called Go Fuck You. Actually, I'm sure it's pronounced Go Fuku, Gofuku. But again, really, really, really inappropriate. And in Canada, there is, I believe it's a town in Nova Scotia called Dildo. And there's a sign, if you Google Dildo Canada, there's a sign that they're sort of applauding themselves for building a new dildo recreation area. Okay, folks, named for Bethesda. Named for Bethesda and Matilda Dildo. I don't know who's named for it, but my favorite of all these, there's a small town in England with the fabulous name of Shitterton. 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 And the town of Shitterton, England has a small problem because juvenile delinquents enjoy stealing their signs. So if you lived on Shitterton Hills, Shitterton Way, Shitterton Pass, whatever, Shitterton, whatever, little street signs are being stolen all the time. And so the town of Shitterton figured out, we got a solution for that. We're going to print all new signs as they get stolen. We're going to take the vowels out of Shitterton. It's not as fun that way. So there are all these signs that now say SHTTRTN way, pass, whatever. But the main sign at the sort of the main drag into town is this sort of 1 foot by 5 foot wooden carved thing that was occasionally being stolen, and they finally had a perfect solution to make sure that the main town or main sign coming into the town of Shitterton is never stolen ever again. They had an artist carve it into an 8,000-pound block of sandstone or limestone, and so now there's a huge boulder at the main at the city limits, pronouncing the town of Shitterton permanently and forever. So good, good on you, Shitterton. Well done.
So the prominent family there, say their last name is, I don't know, Barrett. Oh, you're not the Shitterton Barretts, are you?
Yes, exactly.
Or
Shitterton
if
upon
it's named
Avon.
after a family like in the old times when they would announce everyone, Lord and Lady Shitterton.
Yes, don't know who it's named after.
His Majesty the King.
Second Baron Shitterton. Wait, oh God. And his younger brother,
Okay.
Colostomy. No, okay. So anyway, just some silliness from all over the world.
All right. Well, it's good to know that we're not entirely, and I suspect that it's not all juvenile delinquents are stealing those signs. I suspect there's some adults in there that are doing it too.
Could be.
Who would probably like our podcast. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you for our curse word of the week. Let us turn our attention to. I feel bad about how I'm going to start off my story now. Bryan, is it my turn now?
It is.
We ready to go for my story? Okay. Bryan, when you hear the phrase human potential movement, what do you think? And you and I've talked about this off mic. You're not familiar with this term. Because I think you might think one of three things. You might think, yeah, we all have human potential, but let's talk about your bloodline first.
Right.
Or, and you've already referenced this once, you might think, you said movement. Or you might think, hey, man, everybody's got potential, man. That's groovy. You've just got to dig in and find it.
Uh-huh.
And the kind of potential movement I'm talking about is more in that last example. It comes from the 1960s. The human potential movement is something that I'm actually going to do some non-consecutive episodes on because it is a broad-ranging idea. And for the purposes of this podcast, the way I'll define it is this. It's a series of events, ideas, theories, and practices which encourage individuals to attain self-actualization by reaching their highest individual potential. These individuals, in turn, will help others reach their highest potential, and thus society improves as a whole. Now, that sounds like it could go a number of ways, some of them great, some of them disastrous. But what I'd like to do with this episode is talk about where the human potential movement came from in the 1960s, talk about kind of the origin story of it. And then future episodes will branch out and talk about some of the things that we saw come out of the human potential movement. So the human potential movement, or HPM, if you don't mind that kind of talk, can be traced to the emergence of what we call the third force in psychology. So if there's a third force in psychology, there has to be two other forces. And when you think of the dominant forces in psychology in the 20th century, the first one you probably think of is psychoanalysis, right? The influence of Sigmund Freud. Bryan, did you know that Sigmund Freud's middle name was Shlomo?
I did not know that.
Did you know that?
No.
I didn't either. And the other force is going to be behaviorism, which I'm sure you associate with people like B.F. Skinner and John Watson. So let's take a nutshell analysis and just kind of go over these two things real quickly to talk about why the third force in psychology evolved. Psychoanalysis focuses on the tensions between the conscious and the unconscious mind, right? We have at its root, what you have to have in order for psychoanalysis to work is the existence of the unconscious or the subconscious mind, right? I mean, that's the basis of psychoanalysis, that you've got the superego, the ego, and the id, all in tension. The id represents the base desires. The superego is the part of the personality that makes rules and controls everything. And caught in between them is the ego, your day-to-day conscious mind. Unconscious desires, wants, and fears generate conflict and tensions within a person's psyche. And how do you go about negotiating those fears and ideas? Through analysis, through dream analysis, through talking about symbols, through talk therapy, pulling out these symbols and meaning from the unconscious mind. A patient may come to terms with their psychological struggle. So in the 20th century, the popular imagination, we see psychoanalysis becomes dominant in the practice of the therapeutic environment, right? I mean, I'm sure we can think of all kinds of examples of how we see this relationship between the therapist and the patient in popular media, right? I mean,
Right, sure.
what are some examples of this that we've seen? We see our go-to example, Sidney Freeman in MASH.
Bob Newhart.
When he helps to interpret the way Bob Newhart, right? Or every cartoon you've ever seen in the New Yorker, where a patient lies on a couch and the psychiatrist sits just out of sight of said patient, taking notes and asking questions as kind of a disembodied voice. One of the cartoons that I've always remembered is a cartoonist by the name of Gahan Wilson, who did a lot of cartoons for, I know for sure he did cartoons for, well, the New Yorker. He did cartoons for National Lampoon. He did cartoons for Playboy. And there's this great cartoon that he's got in one of his collections that shows a therapy session from the doctor's point of view. And you see what he's actually writing down, and the patient is clearly gesticulating and talking. And what the doctor has written on his notes is, I, Dr. Carl Schultz, am God and can solve all of mankind's problems and woes. But it's this idea that through talk therapy and working out tensions that you're having, you can come to terms with these buried trauma from your childhood. And it gets into all kinds of complicated things like the Oedipal complex, the Electra complex, these kind of things. Now, how does behaviorism differentiate from that? Behaviorism is, what it does is it says that humans and animals both, basically everything can be explained by the way they respond to their environment, right? And we're all conditioned by that relationship between our environment. And the classic example that everyone always uses is Pavlov's dogs. We all remember that from like a basic psychology course, or being told this story, that the dogs are trained, their food is coming, and eventually you introduce a bell before the food comes. And the dogs always salivate right before they eat because they smell their food. And soon, if you introduce a bell, they start to salivate not at the smell of the food, but at the sound of the bell, because they've associated that operating condition relationship between the bell and the food. And I suspect if we have any psychology people listening to this, they're just shaking their heads the way I'm butchering this.
Right.
But again, this is kind of a nutshell analysis. But one of the behaviorist ways of critiquing psychoanalysis is that psychoanalysis relies too much on interpretation on the therapist's part and not enough empirical data, right? You can't really take psychoanalysis and make replicable studies out of it.
Right.
Because you don't have the same conditions time and time again. You cannot work with empirical data. So psychoanalysis in the 20th century, you might say that while it dominated the therapeutic realm, behaviorism is the primary means of study and academia, right? When you're studying things in the academic realm, that's where behaviorism really takes hold. So the third force in psychoanalysis, what happens there is a bunch of folks who are psychologists start to look at these two major ways of thinking about human psychology. And they say that, well, what's missing in psychoanalysis is conscious choices and positive elements of human endeavor. They say that everything is negative. You're dealing with buried trauma. And of course, there's the whole observed misogyny of Freud's oral, anal, and phallic stages. And at some point, someone says, well, Freud basically paints women as incomplete men because there is no phallic stage for them,
Right.
because this obsession of things that pleasure comes orally, anally, and then through the phallic mode. But Freudian analysis, with the wealth of symbolic study, has become a valuable tool for analyzing texts, say, in literature and film. You can do a psychoanalytic study of a film, for example. And the third force folks would look at behaviorism, and they would say it relies entirely on external stimulus to explain human action. It doesn't look at internal desire or individual choices. So both of these, in a way, are top-down models of how you look at human psychology, not bottom-up. So what these third force folks basically start calling themselves is humanistic psychology. Humanistic, where it places the human individual where a human is able to make choices, have desires, conscious wants, and needs. And you see this in the work of people like Carl Rogers and Rollo May. And I'm sure you've probably heard the name Carl Rogers at some point. At one point in the 20th century, he became the most recognizable psychologist in America. And I'll probably talk about them in future episodes. No?
Wrangler? The Wrangler? No, I can't remember.
Humanistic psychology places the patient or the client, sometimes they use the word client, at the center of the experience and focuses on conscious choice, that the patient can have an enabled part in their own therapy, as opposed to being told this is what's happening to you. They're able to recognize they go along. And what they borrow from the psychoanalytic model is that relationship between the therapist, where they sit and talk therapy, that is good because they can work through issues and problems. So what I'd like to do, now that we see that humanistic psychology, where it comes from, is talk about two people who kind of bridge this gap between the human potential movement and what it did in humanistic psychology. This all happened in the late 50s and early 60s. Let's talk about Abraham Maslow first. You probably recognize that name.
Sure, yeah.
And he's known for his hierarchy of needs is the big one. And I remember first seeing this as a kid. In one of my classes, we had this on the wall. And he's done tons of other stuff beside this. But the hierarchy of needs is a way that people are able to look at something and say, look, all people have this in common. The human condition is designed, is defined by this kind of pyramid where everybody has a base level of things they need to accomplish. And the base is basic stuff: food, water. Some might say clothing or needs, but some other things say food, water, warmth, because depending on where you live in the world, clothing and shelter might not be a necessity if you live in the tropics. But food, water, warmth, basic things you need to survive day to day.
Sure.
And then the level above it on the pyramid is safety and security. Just this idea that you might have to have a police force, education, some kind of societal structure that holds everything together. Level 3 above that, feelings of love and intimacy, a circle of friends, a significant other, family units. Level above that, and there's 5 levels total, esteem, self-esteem through prestige or acknowledgement of your accomplishments. And then the final level is self-actualization. And that is realizing your full potential, your creative work, a term Maslow took from his mentor, a fellow by the name of Kurt Goldstein. Maslow used it in this manner, quote, becoming everything that one is capable of becoming. And that's a tall order, man. That's a lot of stuff. And you might even say that it's an impossible order, that it's something that we're always striving to do, but maybe we can't quite grasp. But I think that's important, because if you do become self-actualized, well, what's after that? I mean, what's the next thing that we reach for? And so some folks have fine-tuned the model after a while, and they add several different levels. And they'll say, like, well, the next thing after that is transcendence. I mean, that's a real tall order, right? Ultimate transcendence. So what this framework does is it says, look, we're all struggling to do something. And most or all of one level should be accomplished before you move on to the next one. And it's not something that you tick off like a box. It is something that you work at every day. Right. And that's what we try to do in the work that we do creatively. We try to build towards this process of okay, what am I going to do next? How do I feel about what I'm doing next? Where am I going? So a lot of people refer back to Maslow, and he would go on to give some speeches and stuff that people really took to heart and made it kind of the center of the human potential movement. How can we get people to the point where we take care of their basic needs and they can start focusing on those top two tiers, developing self-esteem, developing confidence, and working towards self-actualization? Well, let's talk about Huxley for a moment. Aldous Huxley, author, is best known for Brave New World. He gave this speech in 1960, and this is a speech he was giving on college campuses. And this idea that he's going to talk about here in this little clip, this little segment I'm going to talk about, it precedes Huxley. It goes back quite a while before Huxley, but it's an excellent summation of what some have called a, quote, myth. And this is a myth that you've probably heard of. Quoting from the speech, Huxley, "There are still a great many potentialities for rationality, for affection and kindness, for creativity, still lying dormant in man. And since everything has speeded up so enormously in recent years, that we shall find methods for going almost as far beyond the point as we have reached now within a few hundred years, as if we succeeded going beyond our Aurignacian," I had to look this one up, it's a Paleolithic word, "our Paleolithic ancestors in 20,000 years. The neurologists have shown us that no human being has ever used more than 10% of all the neurons in his brain. And perhaps if we sit about it the right way, we might be able to produce extraordinary things out of this strange piece of work that a man is."
Wow.
So in a few hundred years, we have gone far beyond what our Paleolithic folks did in 20,000. And have you heard that the 10% myth before, that we don't use more than 10% of our brain? I mean, that's
No,
a popular.
I've never heard that before.
Oh, you never heard that?
No.
That is something that has been tossed around for a long, long time. That we use just so little of our brain. If we could only get to it, and if you look at I mean, there's a lot of science fiction that's based on that. Let's tap into that unused potential. And so I think about a couple of episodes from that early mid 60s TV show, The Outer Limits, which was an hour long, along the lines of a Twilight Zone. There was an episode called Sixth Finger, where a scientist who's working in a tiny Welsh coal mining town, he invents a machine which accelerates evolution at a cellular level. And a local man agrees to become a guinea pig. And by using the machine, he becomes a future man. And he evolves, and he grows a sixth finger because he's more adept at doing things, and he's learning faster and wanting more information. And it all happens in a span of days. And there's another episode called Expanding Human, where, again, a scientist using psychotropic drugs enhances latent human abilities such as superintelligence, strength, and even ESP. And it's all based on this idea that we're only using a certain portion of our brain. So I'm wondering if these writers, surely they had heard of this speech and this idea, and it was kind of permeating the culture at the time that we were not using our full potential. And along those lines, a guy by the name of Walter Truett Anderson refers, in a book I've been reading on this piece, refers to a talk given by a guy named Joe Adams at the 1969 American Association for Humanistic Psychology. Adams compares the rise of the human potential movement in the 1960s to that of the first Great Awakening, that's the religious movement of the colonial era in United States history. And Tom Wolfe would later look at this idea in his famous The Me Decade, the Third Great Awakening in New York Magazine, 1978, comparing this sudden idea that we could, an idea that appeared sudden but wasn't, that we could really move away from this idea of stunted evolution to this new forefront of making people better by helping them become better individuals. Comparing it to suddenly awakening into this new religious movement, and comparing it to what the colonials went through, or what happened in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, the Second Great Awakening. And I think that's a pretty impressive way to think about it, that it was in a way a very comparable great awakening for people.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I want to start with this idea that these scientists were taking something and psychologists were taking this idea of human potential and what we can do with it. And there's two ideas of potentials and self-actualization and saying, okay, what can we do? Where can this go? And as you can imagine, it went some very great places and some really horrible places.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure
Future
it
and
did.
future installments of the human potential movement. I've already got one that's partially written. Are going to look at something called the Esalen Institute. Huxley did a lot of his early speeches at the Esalen Institute. It's still around. It's in Big Sur in California. We're going to look at transcendental meditation a little bit. We might even look at primal scream therapy. That was kind of a parallel development. The self-help industry in general kind of emerged out of this human potential movement. We're going to look at EST, Erhard seminar training, which came out of this. Because with any movement that is designed to help people become better, you're going to get the scammy stuff that comes with it, right?
Right.
And
Scientology and
destined to make, because and Scientology had been around longer than this movement. Scientology started before this, but there's a lot of stuff in here where you can see someone coming in and saying, well, I know how to do this. And that's what launches you down the cult road, where only I can tell you how to reach your actualized potential. And,
right.
all you got to do is this and this and this and this. And so it's one of those things that, once again, a great idea becomes just absolutely corrupted. And the folks who are like, no, that's not what we meant. Damn it. It's kind of like when God looks down and says, look, what don't you assholes understand about thou shalt not kill? I was pretty fucking clear about it.
Right.
So that's what I hope. That's what I hope to do with these ongoing pieces is take a look at this really curious intellectual movement that really became part of the popular culture and part of the cultural zeitgeist, where everybody knew what you were talking about when you talked about, the Beatles are doing transcendental meditation, and Mom and Dad were going to EST seminars, and John and Yoko were doing primal scream therapy, and all these things that were going on.
Right.
I used two main books for this piece that are invaluable. One's by a woman named Jessica Grogan. It came out in 2013. She's a professor of American Cultural Studies and Psychology. She's taught all over the place, UT Austin, and other universities. And she wrote this great book from Harper Perennial called Encountering America, Humanistic Psychology, 60s Culture and the Shaping of the Modern Self. And William Truett Anderson's book from 1983 called The Upstart Spring, Esalen and the Human Potential Movement, the First 20 Years from iUniverse Incorporated, and then Wikipedia for some basic dates and some basic quotes from the idea. But now that I brought it up, does any of this sound familiar? I mean, does this?
I mean,
kind of what I
painting very much with broad strokes here. I mean, I am. There is some story, and I would have to do some Googling to figure out what it was. I mean, I definitely have been aware of the fact that I know. I mean, I think scientists, medical professionals have always viewed, or for whatever since the 20th century, viewed the brain as being something in the way of a redundant system. Because I know there are all these stories about, a gas fitting explosion sending a metal spike through a man's head and basically eradicating half of his brain, yet he survives and he has still I mean,
Phineas Gage. That's his name.
That's who it. Yeah, right. So that story of there's a personality shift, but somehow his cognition is still there, his emotions are still there, he still has all of his memories, etc. And I seem to recall some medical documentary or something I saw forever ago where someone who was comparatively prominent, a PhD in his field, finds out he has encephalitis, or has basically the space in his cranium is 80% either air or liquid, because of this condition he has, but he's has an IQ of 167 and is has all these wonderful things and is a high functioning human being, but his brain, the actual brain matter, is like 15 or 20% of my brain or your brain, yet he has all this wondrous function. So what is it about brain matter that and neurons and how they fire and how they develop and how you grow over time. It is, I mean, do you only need 5% of that to function with an IQ of 100? I don't know, but so I'm nominally aware of the fact that, I know that, there's more to that sponge than meets the eye.
Yeah, the guy you're talking about, the railroad spike, Phineas Gage, he had a frontal lobe injury, which did affect his personality. Afterwards, he would go to the woods and didn't like to be around people too terribly much. And part of that was because part of his face was paralyzed after the accident. And it was way back when, right? That's one of the first cases they teach you when you take a physiological psychology course or psychopathology course. And it's horrific. I mean, you watch, I remember one semester when I was in college, I had physiological psychology and psychological pathology back to back. I mean, I would like go to one class, go down the hall, and sit in the other one. So you would learn about the brain. It was a brilliant piece of unscripted like scheduling on my part, because I would literally go to a class about the physiology of the brain and then go to a class about how we disrupt it and what happens to it when it gets damaged. And
hopefully you smoked a joint right beforehand.
No, because you would watch things like split brain patients who have the corpus callosum between the two halves of the brain severed, and how they can see something with one eye, but because language is in the other half of the brain, they can't describe what it is they're seeing. Right. If you put a screen right down the middle that bisects the right between the eyes, they can't describe what it is they're seeing. The brain is a remarkable black box of stuff. And when you start adding in elements like these social movements that are like, okay, how can we improve the individual condition? And when you have minds like Abraham Maslow and Rollo May and Carl Rogers, I mean, some of the most brilliant people of the 20th century saying, yeah, we can do better. We can make these things better. And then when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, yeah, you can look at that and say, well, that's pie in the sky thinking. It's like, but it's not, because if you look at the bottom part of the pyramid, when you get into academic discussions, I remember sitting in a class once and people wanted to talk about violence in urban areas. And they were saying, what we need to do is we need to talk about media representations with folks who live in urban areas. And I was like, do you think they give a shit about that? I mean, think about what you're saying. You want to go into an urban area and talk to somebody about when every day is like, I could get shot today. I mean, what the hell are you talking about? No,
right.
Because those parts of, I mean, look at Maslow's. Tell me, you're dealing with stuff up on this pyramid when the bottom part of the pyramid is not being fulfilled. And the fact that we can have a discussion about this on a podcast is proof that you and I are pretty high up on that pyramid in terms of what we have taken care of, the base needs, right? And again, you look at this stuff and you think only in the 60s and only in California would a movement like this start. And I think that's true. At places like the Esalen Institute, and it's one of those positive things you hear about and you're like, wow, that is just, I know that if I were a graduate student, if I just gotten out of college and I heard about the Esalen Institute, I would be like, I'm going, pack my bags. I want to listen to these people talk. I want to be a part of this movement.
Right.
And I want to see what we can do to help people reach that potential. And then the 70s came. Stuff really got weird. As we'll see with Est and some other folks. But anyway, yeah, that's the start of the Human Potential Movement series. So,
nice. Awesome.
There we go.
Yeah, super interesting. I do sort of feel like we should have been, high for all of that, because I'm like, oh, dude, all right, man, bitchin'.
Well, it all kind of comes down to when you look at psychoanalysis versus behaviorism, it kind of gets back to our discussion of the romantics versus the classics, right? I mean, it's like Freud and describing your dreams, that's a very romantic idea versus the classics and behaviorisms of, yeah, but how does it operate? What are the rules? How can you repeat this study? yeah, the motorcycle makes me feel this way, but how does the engine run? Right. Getting back to Robert Piercy's example, it's like,
right.
it's great. Trying to pull together those two different ways of seeing the world, the qualitative versus the quantitative, the romantic versus the classical, and that kind of stuff. But anyway, this is the point when my sons look at me and say, "Now you're being Professor Daddy. Can you just be quiet? And can we just have dinner now, Dad?"
Right. Right.
Dad, we're
We want
Dad, we're
pizza.
at Chipotle. Could you, Dad? We're in line at Chipotle. Could you stop talking to the man behind the counter so you can make our anyway?
Nice. All right. Thanks for that. That was super interesting. I have to admit,
Well, Brian,
you have much more of the academic background, and a lot of that felt like it flew over my head and hit the wall behind me. But still, it's good to learn. Knowledge is power. All that crap.
well, I will say this. I had to do a lot of head scratching putting this together, so I hope it made sense in some way. When we get to it, I think when we start pulling it together and pulling out examples, I don't know. I think it's going to be the kind of thing where if you haven't listened to the episode 59, go back and do that now because it's going to make a whole lot more sense this time around.
Right.
I don't know. I might listen. I might listen to this episode and go, Brian, let's scrap it and re-record it. I have no idea. But,
No. I was definitely I was definitely followed you, but a lot of it is very heady stuff. Pun intended.
Also, I will say that next week, Brian, what starts next week? Do you know? On the day we drop on March 14th, what starts next week?
Well, March Madness is somewhere in there.
So you know what's coming, right? You know what's coming on March Madness Day for our next episode?
Oh, another college game.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I got to do it because it's March Madness. So,
well, at least you warned me this time, so I can maybe do a tiny bit of research.
They're all teams that are going to make the tournament or are in contention to make the tournament. So,
okay, so city,
yeah,
yeah. So city names and mascots of okay. You're gonna torture me with the
and university names. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. University. Okay. All right. I'll do some.
Well, and the listeners. So.
Right. There you go. Start studying now.
All right.
All right. Thanks, folks. We appreciate you listening and doing those things for us. Please like this episode and share it and follow us if you can. Shoot us a review also. That would be helps us climb the charts. We appreciate you doing all those great things for us and for listening and just tagging along for this really silly ride.
That's right. And even if you live in a place called Shitterton, be good to each other.
This is a Rough Tiger production.
Bong bong,
Mm-hmm.
Brian.
Bong bong?
Bong bong.
Bong bong. Good.